Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit and this is my good friend Ajay. And today we're going to discuss two papers that both of us love, that I think are really broad and deep at the same time and have great lessons for us. But before that, I want to ask you a sort of meta question, right? We've done an episode on four papers that changed the world in the past, where we've done like great papers in economic history. Today we are doing two papers closer to the current time. Now, that paper was really popular with a lot of, that episode was really popular with a lot of people. Your episode on how to write a paper was also really popular. But here's something that I worry about, that how do we read and why? For example, we both agree that reading is super important. I wrote a column once where I spoke about how, the importance of reading is that it helps us paint better pictures of the world. We paint pictures of the world by joining dots. The more dots we have, the better our pictures will be. And therefore, reading is critically important. Unfortunately, due to circumstance, we can only live one life, but we can actually experience many other lives and get into the minds of many other people and get a lot of knowledge through books. So that's completely miraculous. But the question here is that how do we think about our own reading habits? What is the role that, say, papers have in it? Like, I've done episodes of The Seen and the Unseen with the great doctors Lancelot Pinto and Abby Phillips, and both of them realize that most doctors, they learn their stuff in college, but they're not updating it all the time. So they are all the time making time on a daily basis to read papers, to keep abreast of the world. But for generalists who are not in a specific technical profession where they need to stay abreast with the world, what should our attitude should be? One way of looking at it is that, hey, researchers bring out papers and then the good ideas bubble up to the top and then they make it to mainstream media and there are books made out of them, and we should just wait for them, let the sorting be done by others. Whereas another way of thinking is a lot of good stuff may get lost, and it's really great to stay current and on the ball and at the cutting edge by reading papers. So how do you think about this at a descriptive level, and at a normative level, how should other people think like this? Because you have limited time for reading, there's limited bandwidth. How does one approach this?
There is undoubtedly a supply chain of ideas, and various pieces of the story are all important. So I don't wish to demean any component of the supply chain of ideas. Um, I think it's interesting and important to think about the place of papers and the place of books. The great economist Ed Glaeser has a lovely pithy line. He says, read books for ideas, read papers for techniques. Okay, which is sort of one way to see the social sciences, that in constructing papers in the world of the social sciences, we have taken a stab at a level of persuasiveness which is pretty high, and that ends up being narrow, it ends up being involuted. It has its place, but it's not the full picture. That the very pursuit for rigor has induced rigor mortis. And you also need to nurture the space of big ideas, and books are the platform where that is happening. Blog articles is where that is happening. YouTube shows and podcasts is where that is happening, where there is a more freewheeling, more eclectic approach, not fighting to dot every I and cross every T, and to go after an idea and be willing to speculate and be a world builder and be a system builder. And I feel everybody needs a combination of both. You need a certain amount of world building, you need a certain amount of precise, careful, detailed data work. So this is my first thought, that all of us need both. Some people are in the belly of the beast, they are in the knowledge economy, they are in the institutional apparatus through which knowledge is produced. And in the early years of that, we are always taught, shut up and read papers, shut up and write papers, be narrow, don't think more, like just be a galley slave like everybody else. And I just say to those people that your life will be better if you are more interested in the big ideas and the whole journey of the human race and of human knowledge, because that is the beautiful thing about existence. And we are all little participants of something big and beautiful. The next thing I'd like to say is the problem of memorization. Many people say to me, look, I'm not going to remember a whole lot, so why should I bother to read? And my answers are in two parts. The first is that the more you know, the more you will retain. It's a bloody vicious cycle. It feeds on itself. There is a feedback loop there. So when we go into some new knowledge for the first time, we just dimly parse it and we understand a very limited amount of it and very little of it sticks. But the more you know, then you actually have a lot of context, and then a few new pieces of reasoning come in, and then they stick to your brain nicely. And so in fact, the learning process has increasing returns to scale. And in my opinion, this fuses beautifully with the emerging world of higher and higher health span. You can only imagine what human beings will be like when the health span goes to 95 and 105. Those people will be computers of a different order altogether. Like what they have known, what they have seen, what they have cogitated will be something new in world history. We've never had people at that level of knowledge and clarity and perspective in the entire history of humankind. So there's something there for chipping away, and your retention will improve. But just remembering and retaining is not the game. The best way to read a paper is to think about it as an argument, that you are arguing with the author, and literally every 1 or 2 paras, in my mind, I'm sort of constructing disagreements or an alternative approach, and that goes by the modern, crude, vulgar phrase active learning. Okay, so I call it active learning when it comes to reading papers. But read a paper like a conversation, like argue with the author. And for me personally, one of the biggest and wildest experiences of reading a book where literally every page I was just like bubbling and bursting with dialogue and argument and talking to the author was Seeing Like a State. And that doesn't mean that book is perfect. It just means it came to me at a moment in my life and my journey where it's like I was primed and ready for it. And I just remember literally page after page, my mind would be bursting with the conversation. Like sometimes I'm disagreeing with him. Sometimes I am just so unhappy because where he's going is completely antithetic to what I used to think then. And sometimes I was offering alternative arguments. Isn't this an alternative explanation? But that way of reading, which is a conversation and an argument, is really something that is far more powerful than sort of a passive reading or an Indian rote memory examination orientation that I got to get this stuff.
James C. Scott cured you of the fatal disease of seeing like an engineer, which you no longer do. And I will correct a typo by you. At one point where you spoke about the process of learning, you said vicious cycle. I would say virtuous cycle, which is surely what you meant. You know, there is a framework I came up with where I'm borrowing terms from economics, but I'm applying those terms in this new framework to think about the creative world, which is, the terms are stock and flow. Right. And I think that in the creative universe for creators, and in creators, I include you because you are creating papers, you are engaged in ideas, you're creating books. In the creator universe, there is also a stock and there is a flow. Now, a flow is a constant production of, content, which doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, all the way from tweets to articles to columns to episodes like this one to papers, and that's all flow. And flow is great because you always need to be thinking, you always need to engage in a dialogue with the world so that the feedback loops that creates makes your work better. And then on the other hand, there is stock, which is your stock of knowledge, which forms that body of knowledge on which others build, and that includes books or maybe a documentary series like Friedman's Free to Choose, etc., etc. And I think the best papers are not just flow. The best papers can also be stock. Like I think both the papers that we are talking about today are, show no sign of the rigor mortis that you spoke about. They contain big ideas in a sense, and they could be books by themselves. And so I'm excited to get started. So a few months ago, I read an episode with the World Bank economist Biju Rao, Vijendra Rao, known as Biju to his friends. Absolute wonderful man. We hit it off. Great episode, one of my favorite episodes. And he has written this awesome paper called "Can Economics Become More Reflexive?" Right? And the central funda behind the paper, the central thought, is actually the central thought behind the show. The thought behind the show is that everything is everything. Everything is interconnected. Don't be too narrow. Don't stay in a silo. Don't stay in a lane. Whether it is in terms of frameworks or methods or ways of looking at the world, embrace everything. Any one way will be too narrow. It is only through a multitude of ways that you get more and more wisdom from different places. And the central point of Biju's paper is that in his view, economics anthropology and sociology, which were all essentially part of the same quest to understand society, to understand human beings, why we behave the way we do. And his point is that they all became narrower and narrower, that you had quantitative economics, which depends a lot on numbers and data on the one hand. You had cultural anthropology, which has a completely different flavor to it, and you have qualitative sociology, and they veered into different lanes and turned away from each other, thereby losing the insights that you can get from the realization that everything is everything. Now, at the start of this great paper, Biju cites from this book called The Life and Labour of the People of London by Charles Booth. It was written in the late 19th century. Now, this book took I think 17 years to compile, and there were like a whole bunch of volumes, so it is just a massive monumental work. And if you look at the methods behind this, you couldn't say that this is economics or this is anthropology or this is sociology, etc., etc. None of that was there. It looked at a lot of data. It did household surveys. It looked at participant interviews. There was a lot of observation of what is going on, etc., etc. So all the different methods from what today we would consider different fields came together. And it wasn't just done once ki ek baar aapne data le liya, or you do it once a year. It was a continuous process over these 17 years. And in the end, this multi-volume book painted an incredibly rich life of the people of London, where you looked at things like employment, which is easy to get through only quantitative data. You can just ask people, okay, what do you do? It looked at circumstances, which is harder to arrive at. So circumstances like illness, like infirmities, like family size, all of those individual circumstances. And it looked at habits, individual habits. Are there people who are drunkards? How much do people save? What are habits of thrift, etc., etc. And it combined all of this data, some of which may seem fuzzy, some of which may seem cold, and it combined all of this into a magisterial picture almost of what was London like, what were the poor like, what were the rich like, how were neighborhoods evolving, and all of this. And Biju's point is that it is almost in a sense that kind of work was part of a dying breed. Because then what happened through the 20th century, led by incentives, is that each of the fields went into these different silos, and it was driven by incentives. And there is a great line by Biju which I love, where he says the methods lead the questions. Right now, we did an episode earlier where we spoke about the changing forms of creativity. Right, we spoke about how where you are performing determines the kind of music that is performed. That in open air you'll have more percussive stuff. That in the large Gothic churches of Europe, where there is so much reverberation, you can't have percussion, you can't have multitonal music. It's you get the kind of music that you did then, that you'll get alternative rock and funk in a place like CBGB's Crowded Room. Similarly, you see the influence of form here. The methods determine the questions. So in his paper, Biju writes, there are artificial distinctions of method that limit us as social scientists. We economists think of ourselves as quantitative social scientists. Cultural anthropologists and some sociologists see themselves as ethnographers who rely on participant observation and qualitative methods. The reasons for this divide are a vestige of disciplinary history. Our scholars are trained and assessed for tenure. By limiting ourselves to one set of methods, we limit the questions we can ask and constrain ourselves in the data available to answer them. The methods lead the questions rather than the other way around. So what happens here is that there is a trade-off between two ways of approaching a problem, right? One is a quantitative way. You get as much data as you can, but other people are gathering this data for you. Even if an economist is gathering their own data, you will have survey agencies and all of that. This creates a distance, a social and cultural distance, as Biju calls it, between the observed and the observer, who will often use the word subjects, which immediately, implies that sense of distance. But the good part of getting all of this data is that you get scale. You can understand phenomena at a larger scale, right? You cannot do a weather report of, say, Karjat by only focusing on Karjat and what's happening in the skies. You have to have a much broader view, and you get that broader view by looking at all the data, by looking at all the information. But on the other hand, you have the ethnographic view, that you don't actually get the local nuances. You don't get to see how people see themselves. There's a great anthropologist called Bhrigupati Singh, who Biju quotes in his paper, and Bhrigupati talks about the processes of doing ethnography. Ethnographic method may be seen as a two-phase process. In the first phase, one is a hunter-gatherer, pursuing targets, collecting impressions. The next stage of labor is of a more settled cultivator. As we move from impressions to expressions, you plow through what you have gathered, jostling with others who face similar phenomena and arrived at different thoughts. When impressions are organized and attached to concepts, they turn into thoughts and expressions. Concepts are seeds from which the expressions grow into thoughts. Our concepts may also be limiting and force us to convey much less than what we saw and felt. And that first phase, the hunter-gatherer phase, where the ethnographer goes into the field and they're gathering a deer and they're gathering a chicken or whatever, they're gathering impressions in a piecemeal kind of way, that actually forms a caricature of a view of what the field is like. And an economist could look at that and say, hey, all of that is anecdotes and it doesn't, it's not representative, right? It doesn't work for me. But as Bhrigupatil describes, actually the process is much deeper. If you do it properly, it is a long game. You spend a long, long time in a particular place. You have long conversations. You kind of meld into that local culture and milieu, and then you begin to get all the nuances that there are. But there is a problem with this kind of data also. It is that number one, you can't really scale it. You do a particular village, but you have no idea of what's happening in the state. You don't know those broader trends. You may miss the forest for the trees, as it were. So it is not representative data. And that becomes a problem of this process. And that creates that creates a trade-off, that which of these do you choose? And the important question, is it the case that you can only choose one and not both? This paper is really well expressed by this 1998 paper by Michael Buroway called the extended case study method, right? And he says there are two ways of doing things, the positivist and the reflexive. And the positivist is the economist way. We limit our involvement in the world we study, insulating ourselves from our subjects, observing them from the outside, interrogating them through intermediaries. We keep our feet on the ground by adhering to a set of data collection procedures that assure our distance. We try to avoid affecting the situation we study. We standardize a collection of data. We bracket external conditions and make sure our sample is representative. And the other approach, the ethnographic approach, is not detachment, the detachment of the quantitative economists, but engagement, right? Detachment, not engagement, which means that you embed yourself in a particular community and you are not, a non-factor in what you're observing. You're actually affecting what you are observing. So Biju's broader point is that these need not be separate. Boroway's point in this paper was that these are necessarily separate. Like, how the hell do you combine the two? If you're going to get scale, if you're going to get a lot of data, you have to be at a distance and you get the breadth. And if you want the depth, then you can get the depth, but it's not giving you a greater insights. And Biju's point is that no, economists can learn from ethnographers and they can do this in four distinct ways by keeping four things in mind. And one of them is this beautiful phrase, which was coined by Mario Small, and it's a phrase called cognitive empathy. Now, what is cognitive empathy? Cognitive empathy is seeing another person as they see themselves, right? So, if I see you as poor and starving, my empathy should not be from my point of view that this person is poor and starving and etc., and my mirror neurons kick in and I try to imagine what it is to be hungry. But it is to actually understand from that person, how do they see themselves? Which could be radically different from how you may see them. And an example of how cognitive empathy comes about comes from this early paper that Biju was doing, or rather his experience while doing this paper. In 1992, he was, along with a group of researchers, he was at this village and they were talking to women about their household income and their lives and all of that. And there was a group of women. And at one point he says that while he was talking in this room full of women, the husband of one of the women comes in and he grabs her by the hair and he pulls her out of the room. And her sin is talking to this guy, talking to Biju, right? And Biju at that point realizes, and this is reflexivity, that by by putting himself in a situation, he is actually changing the situation. There is a dynamic that has now come to life in this particular place, right? So anyway, the researchers keep doing what they're doing in that particular village, and for about a week, when the women are asked about their problems, they're blaming the state, and you and I could empathize with that. They're saying, oh, the schools are terrible and we don't get good drinking water and all our problems are because of that. But once a certain trust has been built, after about a week, then the women change their tune and they actually open up what they are really thinking once that filter has kind of dropped. And one of them says to Biju, You have become our friends and we can't lie to you anymore. Let me tell you the truth. We feel like we are in jail. Our husbands beat us all the time and no one helps when that happens. They spend all the family money on alcohol and when they come home, no one can help us. And then Biju goes on to write in his paper about the insights that then come as they begin tracking this over time. So not just a one-time, questionnaire filled in, but they track it over time. And Biju writes, the analysis of the qualitative and the quantitative data demonstrated the links of domestic violence to issues of control and power within the family. Female sterilization, which led to an increased risk of being accused of infidelity, alcoholism, and dowry demands. Since the qualitative work demonstrated, among other things, that domestic violence was often a rational choice undertaken to forcibly extract money from the wife's family, it also led us to rethink how economists modeled both intra-household and transfers behavior. Without the fieldwork, we would never have thought of studying domestic violence. And what Biju and his fellow researchers do is decide to write this as a paper that combines all of these methods and all of these insights, but they can't publish it because an economic journal will never publish it. They view the qualitative stuff as, too soft, anecdotes, etc., etc., etc. What matters to them is hard data, and other journals don't really care about the data. So he ends up publishing two papers, and one of them is in a public health journal that takes a mixed methods approach, and the other one takes an economics approach, and it's in an economic journal. And this is just completely pointless, and it's a process that really takes years because these papers come out a few years later, one by one. I'm sure they go through different kinds of peer review, and that kind of tells you that it is not only the methods that determine the questions, but it is also the incentives in play that determine a perpetuation of the methods, and therefore the same kind of narrow questions, because your incentives are always tailored towards a pub orientation, as you have said, that you need to get published in certain journals to get your tenure, to rise up the ladder, and there's only a particular kind of paper that is accepted, there is only a particular kind of methodology that is accepted, and that's the way it works. Now what Biju's papers seen together demonstrate is a richness of insight, right? And in fact, some of the richness of insight of the pure economics paper in that came from the mixed methods that were used as well. They inform that work. The data begins to come to life. It is not merely numbers. You can go a little deeper. So point one that Biju is making, how can economists learn for ethnographers, is that develop cognitive empathy, that don't just treat subjects as subjects. So they're at a distance, we will study them, we will send a survey group, get some numbers, and then we will give gyan from a distance. But it's talk to them, understand them. Don't just talk to them, but stay with them for a while. Try and get a deeper insight of what the hell is going on. The second of the four things that Biju says economists can learn from ethnographers is to take words seriously. Economists will typically take numbers seriously, but not so much words. And there is a phrase which is coming into vogue. I think there was a book on it a few years back called narrative economics. And his point is that numbers don't tell you the full story. Words can tell you a lot, right? But not words, looked at without rigor, that you take a small sample size of what people are saying and you draw large conclusions from that. But words, carry a lot of the stories that are missing when we look at only the numbers. So, he's given examples of papers that kind of do this and that come at drastically different conclusions from what they would have if they only look at the numbers. The numbers will give you like a static picture. Whereas if you go deeper into the narratives that people have about themselves, that people have about their circumstances, and you let that play out over time, you get a much better picture. In fact, in part of the paper, Biju talks about something that I think will really come to fruition in the years to come much more than it has now, which is how do you use machine learning to parse the words that people are saying. You get 10,000 interviews from villages and whatever, but it's a lot of data, and the human tendency will be to look at it selectively, to miss patterns or to see things that we are predisposed to seeing. But machine learning can, go through all of the data, all of the words, and come up with, interesting insights. Not that you rely on it on its own, but it's a great tool to help you see things that you might otherwise not have seen. The third thing that economists should think about, as per Biju, is process. He writes in his paper, What are the minute details, the slow day-to-day shifts that make change happen, the close observation of which is so central to a good ethnography? Empirical economics, particularly since the credibility revolution, has been almost entirely focused on the measurement of outcomes. Understanding the mechanisms that lead to these outcomes has generally been relegated to theory. Structural economics and some work in causal inference does attempt to get at mechanisms, but this is usually done either via speculation, by relying on theory to create a story why a certain intervention may have resulted in a certain outcome, or in discrete pieces, by analyzing heterogeneity in impacts, or by designing experiments with arms that can tease out some element of how different kinds of stimuli might result in different outcomes. What is not done is often to do the most obvious thing, to keep a close eye on the ground, to observe how change happens by embedding oneself in a site over an extended period, to create detailed observations of the process of change. Right? And this reminds me of that old sort of saying by Heraclitus, no man steps in the same river twice. Right? The man has changed, the river has changed. And similarly, a mistake that a quantitative economist may make is that you take a snapshot of a place at a particular point in time and maybe another snapshot a while later, and you have those two snapshots and you come up with theories. But what an ethnographer does is that, she follows the process of actually staying with the people, going a little deeper, seeing the change happen as it happens. To quote from your favorite Chinese personality, Deng Xiaoping, crossing the river by feeling the stones, right? So that is, something that Biju says that you have to take into account. And the fourth thing that Biju says economists can learn from ethnographers is participation. In the sense, the way economists will often treat a subject or do an experiment or whatever is that they'll have subjects and they'll go there and they'll do questionnaires or they'll make things happen, they'll do interventions, they'll see what happens. But the subjects are subjects, as the term itself indicates, right? And what ethnographers will often do is that they won't treat the people they are studying as subjects, but make them participants in what is actually going on. So Biju and a team of people at the World Bank, in fact, carried out this experiment in 2014 where they went to a bunch of villages of South India and they got tribals together to talk about the things that mattered to them, right? A typical economic approach would have been that, okay, you're studying poverty, you look at, where are the jobs, what is the income, what is the seasonality, etc., etc. But they went for the qualitative data and they asked these people that, hey, listen, what matters to you? And from there, they try to figure out what are the metrics that they should track. And from there, a lot of behavior, which otherwise would not make so much sense, began to make sense. And he points out that eventually they came out with a questionnaire to track their progress over time, which had only 17% of the questions in common with the National Sample Survey. Right? So the National Sample Survey, possibly designed in Delhi by some bureaucrats, saying these are the things that matter for poverty and this is what we must do. These are the questions we ask. This is how people look at their own well-being. But over here, there is a participatory process where you try to get cognitive empathy, as it were. How do people see themselves? And you let them participate rather than, just be recipients of your largesse. And again, so to sum it up, these are the sort of four areas that Biju talks about. There is cognitive empathy, learn to see other people as they see themselves. Then there is narrative economics, going beyond the numbers and going into the words. Then there is thinking about process. And finally, the participation of the people that you're studying in the process itself.
This is all extremely fascinating. It is good and important for all of us to put the processes of knowledge under the microscope. That there are not some great people, some Harvard, IIT people who are going to make knowledge, and we are supposed to humbly accept that these great brand names are to be trusted with the way in which they manage themselves. In fact, there are many difficulties in this world, as we have done in one episode on the knowledge economy. In history, there were thinkers about the world and they were called philosophers, and there were no disciplinary boundaries. Then came the universities who set up departments, and there came the modern scientific journals. And now suddenly there was a whole HR problem about hiring people and firing people and promoting people, which created tremendous incentive distortions in each field. So then the senior professors of each department started saying that We want you to prove yourself by publishing in ABCD journals. And those journals were the little clubhouse of that discipline. And it created a narrowing of the vision of the nature that you describe. I've also observed that all too often we lose sight about means and ends, about questions versus methods. So in economics, there is a great vulnerability to lurch from one fad to another, and I'll come back on the issues of why. But what tends to happen is that some fad becomes very successful and they gain control of the journals. And then effectively through their control of the journals, they're controlling the appointments. Because to get appointed, to get promoted, you need those journal pubs. And then suddenly every single academic has to either exit the academic business or they have to fall in line and conform with the fad of the day. And I just think this is extremely harmful. The people who control the journals, who are part of like each fad, tend to consider themselves to be above all practical concerns, but realistically we are all people and people respond to incentives, and the people who control journals respond to incentives, and there is a natural bias in favor of the papers that make your own literature look good. So diverse views are often not published. The journal referees and editors are not really quite respectful of curiosity and inquiry, and instead demand that you must fit in a certain kind of uniform before you come into the clubhouse. And I feel this has been deeply harmful. And this is the source of the narrowness of disciplinary inquiry, that how can you go to this clubhouse of this journal with a more eclectic approach of taking interest in the world and studying the world that would not survive this disciplinary focus of departments and journals and incentives. So this has all been extremely harmful. Now at the same time, a lot of people recognize that. So for as long as I can remember, the leaders of universities have understood that the narrow disciplinary emphasis is a problem, and they've always tried to foster interdisciplinary research. So there is the danger that this is just cliched and they are mouthing something but they're not actually living it, and we do have to be concerned about the extent to which that is true. But I think a lot of people have understood that by hiding in one department and chipping away at the work of the department, you're often not going to give insights into the world. Now, when you bring up these ideas with the economists, they will say that we have two rooms in the house inside the economics departments. On one hand, we are tool building. So we're doing work of the nature of developing theory and of the nature of developing statistical methods. Okay, and that typically tends to be done in the econ department. And then we put it to work in taking interest in the real world in a business school or in a department of public policy. So public policy schools and business schools tend to be more real world oriented, and economics then views itself as a little more pure science, where they want to develop theoretical models and they want to develop the statistical methods. The problem with this worldview is that, of course, there is a large chunk of economics which doesn't fit either of these two heads, that there is many pieces of applied economics which is not what business schools do and which is not what schools of public policy do, and really it belongs more in economics departments. So I feel that the economics defense that actually we have two rooms in the house and we also have people who look at the world, is not adequate, because in terms of the resource allocation there is just too little going on by way of looking at the world in a honest way with a fresh set of eyes, taking interest in the world. And they have not solved the problems of how to do truly interdisciplinary work of the kind that you described. There has been again and again a piece of economics where it becomes methodological purity. So there was a time when randomized control trials were the thing. There was a time when instrumental variables was the thing. There was a time when experimental economics was the thing. And I frankly get distressed at each of these. I feel that the best way to approach the world is to be curious and interested in the world, and then synthesize a useful toolkit that is feasible and relevant and applicable to the questions at hand. that I feel every time we face the world, we should innovate and create an appropriate tool chain that is good for the questions that we face. Our loyalty should be to questions, but again and again in economics, it just becomes methodological purity, that if you are not doing real business cycles, it is not real macroeconomics. If you are not doing DSGE models, it is not real macroeconomics, and so on. And this is just like very childish, and the sooner we get past these kinds of behaviors, the better it is. What we need ultimately are the big thinkers, and then a supply chain surrounding the big thinkers, where the big thinkers put a flag in the ground around big complex arguments, and then an array of detailed work happens in working out those ideas. And in economics, we are no longer conducive to big ideas. We're just a very narrow discipline. Okay, now turning to the questions of data, statistics, and the ethnographic method. There is a beautiful sentence that I'd like to bring up. Statistics are human beings with the tears washed away.
Beautiful.
Okay, and I feel that there are many concerns about how the more ethnographic approach works on this. So let me run through a few issues. One idea is that if you become even remotely loyal to your subject, then it hinders objectivity. Okay, so for example, I constantly worry about myself that I'm so loyal to India, I care so much about India, that I feel it interferes with my objectivity. Like, I'm rooting for us, and that is a problem. And I recognize that it is a problem, and I feel it's better to be cold and objective. I mean, if I studied Cambodia, I feel I'd be a good scholar. Studying India is dangerous because,
Oh, you're still a good scholar.
yeah, but I'm self-aware that understanding social phenomena is very difficult. The mind is a slippery thing, and you can just slip into some propaganda and some narrative battles that make me feel good, either because I have somehow a loyalty to traditional Indian culture or the respect of my forefathers, or because I'm rooting for us and I want us to succeed. And these are all very dangerous places to be. That if you carry a sense of cultural pride, it is a really damaging thing for objectivity. We should understand the world as it is. And so in that spirit, it is a very good thing to emphasize the data and not see the tears. Okay, so I think there's a lot to be said for objectivity, because me too, that when I go closer to the people, and particularly to the experience of mass deprivation in India, the blood rushes to your head, and it's very difficult to keep your head straight. And I struggle with this, and I run away, I take refuge in data. So that is one part of it, that it's very difficult to protect yourself and stay cold and logical and analytical. And that's our only hope. Like, we'll never get anywhere through emotions. We will only get through using the methods of objectivity and the scientific method and evidence. And then this brings me to the exact counterpoint, which is go out of your room and bloody talk to the people. Okay, that is so important, it cannot be understated. For me personally, I've never put it into any formal research methodology or research technique. Okay, so for me, research papers are formal set piece battles. Okay, it's like you start, there's a question, you come up with a cool way to go about it, you build the work, you write the paper, you publish the paper. Okay, it's a set piece battle. But somehow, I've had the good fortune that all along I always knew that the real insights are out there with the people, and you have to be talking to the people. So I never bring the people into the project. But my life design is that you should talk to the people that are in the economy. So as an example, I believe one of the best places to live in India to study the Indian economy is Bombay, because Bombay contains the non-financial firms and the financial firms, and the everyday conversations you have with practitioners in Bombay are rich with insights. You will learn firms, you will learn finance, which is the heart and soul of the journey to growth, and you will get a real world practical experience of what are they thinking, what are their compulsions. When you see something in the data, what was going on in their heads, why do they think they did what they did, which of course doesn't mean that that's the correct explanation of what they did. As Milton Friedman taught us, the person playing billiards will never say that I thought about Newton's laws, but they behave as if they thought using Newton's laws. So, one should be careful to draw the lines, but I have always made it my business to engage with non-financial firms, to engage with financial firms, to talk to people face to face, to have many, many years of the development of trust so that people stop giving you their press releases and start talking more honestly about what is the world as they see it and what are the problems that they face and how their constraints lead to their decision making with some modicum of truth, or as I say, the truth as they know it, which need not be the truth. Similarly, it's important to talk to officials, it's important to talk to politicians. On previous shows, I've said that it's important to do a factory visit or a field visit wherever you get an opportunity. So I've had a glorious experience where once I was given the privilege of a 4-hour walk in a mall where the head marketing of a garments firm explained the garment business to me. Okay, and these are peak experiences in terms of learning the world. So we should take every opportunity we can to go closer to the world, because that brings common sense. It gives you a sense of the world and you obtain a set of hypotheses about what might be going on, and then you turn around and do the clean data work. Finally, I want to put a little bit of jargon on things that you said. I want to introduce the words internal validity and external validity. Internal validity is where I went and I studied one village and my paper makes some claims about that village, and are those claims true or false? That is called internal validity. And you could be correct for one village or you could be wrong for that village. External validity is an entirely different matter. It is about the extent to which we are able to take claims on a larger scale. So just because something is happening in one village, it doesn't mean it's happening in other villages or it is happening in the overall country. What average claims would you make about the overall country? That's a very different proposition from a paper that you might write about one village. And it's important to maintain a separation between the two. I was reading a paper recently on the subject of an e-filing system in one country. Okay, and there were all kinds of claims being made that e-filing did this. And as I was reading the paper, I was thinking, no, it was not just the e-filing that did it. E-filing is always a part of a complex reform, and there are 500 subtle details of law, public administration, invisible infrastructure, culture and norms which intermediate the real world ramifications about how an official talks to a private person in the context of an e-filing system. The reductionist mistake we make in economics is we think e-filing did it. Well, actually 100 things were going on and all of them came together in the context of an e-filing system to create that outcome. And the danger is that if we only look at the data sets, then we tend to miss that. And if we only get drowned in one village, then we normalize that reality, we normalize the invisible infrastructure, the social norms, the mores, the invisible constraints, the climate, the agricultural practices of that village. And we then overemphasize our claims about intervention X having generated effect Y. It's not the intervention that did it, it is the intervention in all that context. And this is where I'm a great admirer and a user of a more old-fashioned tradition in economics, which is longitudinal data or panel data. You observe the same firms over and over operating all over the country. You observe the same households over and over all over the country. And then when you expose these to statistical analysis, you get overall average claims about India, which I find are the most useful statements to go. And of course, they are averages. Of course, Gujarat will be different from Maharashtra. If you're interested in Gujarat, you should be studying the data in Gujarat and so on. But it is interesting and important to construct average statements about India, and I love to do that using longitudinal data. I think it's one of the great tools for understanding the world.
You articulated the trade-off really well, but if I may think aloud about that superb quote about, numbers being human beings with the tears wiped out, I would simply say that you got to get closer to that and see the tears but not cry yourself. I agree with you that as a researcher, as a scholar, one should be cold and rational and just look at what there is in front of one. So we shouldn't cry ourselves. Our tears shouldn't get into the picture, but we have to see their tears, understand why those tears are there, where they come from, what do they think about it. And the other side of the trade-off obviously is that if you're just going to extrapolate from your narrow situation, you could completely, miss what is happening. everything. You can't sit in a village, and if that village is the only thing you see, you can't solve the great problems of economics. You will, in fact, get it completely wrong by, perhaps asking for more stratism and etc., without seeing the underlying invisible infrastructures, without seeing the underlying structural issues at play. So there I completely agree. To go back to what you were talking about earlier, I once did an episode with the philosopher Rebecca Goldstein, who had written a book on Plato, right? Now, if you look at the early philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and so on, they were basically the same as scientists. The term philosopher basically meant someone who is inquiring into everything. So they will think about math, and they will think about biology, and they will think about botany, and they will think about ethics. And over time, what happens is that actual science, as it were, actual science comes into this, and more those get disaggregated away. So no philosopher today is going to talk about botany. No philosopher is really going to talk about physics. What philosophers talk about is the knotty problems that science hasn't gotten to and perhaps cannot get to, like questions of ethics or aesthetics and so on and so forth, right? And while it's wonderful that you have all these subjects emerging out of that original subject of philosophy or proto-science, you have all these subjects emerging. I think every time you take a subject and you slap a label on it, you say, okay, this is botany, or you say this is economics, you are at one level performing a service by clarifying what you are studying, but at another level you're performing a disservice by cutting it off from everything else and therefore becoming exclusionary. And as you pointed out, because of the trends in academia towards greater and greater specialization, that's gotten worse. So one lament both of us I know have is of the disappearance of what would be called the Renaissance man or the Renaissance person who is interested in all things. So before we go to the next chapter, one final sort of question, that how do you think about breadth versus depth? Because I could say that I am going to be someone who knows two subjects very deeply and I will talk about nothing else. Or I could say that I will know many subjects reasonably well, but the danger there is that a lot of that knowledge could be half-baked, right? Whereas a danger with my depth could be that I understand only that and nothing else, and therefore, I don't understand anything at all because everything is everything.
In my opinion, given the way we have come in the formal enterprise of systematized knowledge production in institutions such as universities, research labs, etc., we have overemphasized the disciplinary and specialization thing. So, as a first approximation, my thought is almost each of these people will do better by more breadth. And that doesn't mean that all breadth is always the right strategy, but given where we are from, there is a nice lovely gradient to be climbed by increasing breadth. So, I feel given the history of where we have come from, given this peculiar set of problems around the incentives of conventional research and knowledge production, I think more breadth is always a good thing. And Amit Bhai, since you have refused my kind advice all your life and not created the firm Amit Bhai Media Private Limited, I now have a better name. It should be called Amit Bhai Philosophy Private Limited. Okay, we should resurrect the word philosophers, who are really people who are interested in the world and are willing to be eclectic and come at it from diverse perspectives. And it's a great phrase, and it is alive and well. And we should deny the claim of departments of philosophy to controlling the word philosophy. That really the old style concept of a philosopher is important and relevant in this world. And don't you think Amit Bhai Philosophy Private Limited is an even better firm name?
Your earlier suggestion was a low level equilibrium suggestion, and this one is even lower level, Ajay Bhai. So, what to do? But at this point, I must ask you a question, which is, you have spoken about what to do when there is a problem of too much depth. What do you do when there is a problem of too much breadth? No, no, you're thinking seriously. Don't think seriously.
Ah, you're thinking Ozempic.
Well done.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I want to come back to the problem of detachment. Okay, you said we should be cold scientists looking from our ivory towers,
I didn't say
occasionally,
ivory towers.
occasionally walking down and greeting our subjects, but being emotionally remote from them. I want to say we should be self-aware about our capacity for remoteness. So I know, speaking for Susan and me, we know how it is impossible for us to be remote, and that's one of the reasons why we hide in the data.
So, gentle readers, at the start of this episode, we said we shall talk about two papers today, but time has gone by. We have to go for lunch. We'll talk about the other paper some other time. But I want to go back to the question that I asked you at the start, which is I asked you, how should people think about the universe of knowledge in terms of reading? You gave an answer from the producer's perspective that papers are important, books are this, books are where the big ideas are, they're important, papers are important for a different reason, etc., etc. But as a reader, how does one think about it? How do I sort of distribute my time?
So here are a bunch of ideas that we should bring to this. There are narrow papers that can be important because there's a precise, sharp question that is being processed. In this, you have to have one important bullshit alert. When a person writes a paper on Tamil Nadu, but puts up a title that does not contain the word Tamil Nadu, then this is a guy grabbing for fame and glory, and you should be more skeptical about their work. Okay, this is a disease in the advanced economies where papers on America don't believe in putting the word America in the title. So in fact, that's a paper about a narrow specific locale, and the results don't generalize. And I absolutely do not share the arrogance of the economists who believe that they are creating universal truths. Actually, every locale is different, and authenticity is very important. So I feel that we should not accept grandiose titles which make claims that are universal, and actually the work is one particular data set, is one particular locale. And when an author is self-aware and writing a more modest title and a more modest abstract, it speaks well for the human qualities of the author. Otherwise, they're just like frat boys running for tenure, and you've got to be more careful around that. So that's one trick on how to process this landscape and read more carefully. The second is it's important to always have a mix of complex big ideas, integrations of knowledge that are motivated by an interest in the world, along with the more narrow technical papers. And this can be papers and books on the complex integrating views. So we always need the people who will read literatures and perform that sense making function of putting it together and pulling together a story of the world. And that will be called speculative, and it may not publish in the famous journals who claim that we are pursuing rigor. But actually, you very badly need that. Otherwise, only by reading those narrow papers, it's harder to grok the world. Now, for me personally, I've reached a point where in many, many fields, I have a picture in my head. I have a sense of the world. Okay, so, you and I have produced dozens of episodes of Everything is Everything, where we each of us have like a fully coherent point of view on one field after another. Then in that field, we are entitled to go read one narrow paper at a time. But if the reader is starting out into a new subject, then it's wise to first get that big picture through reading about the overall scene rather than just diving into the narrow technical papers. Uh, these kinds of approaches of mixing narrow and open-ended and speculative is a good mix, but then the problem that will come is many people don't have the training and the intuition on reading research papers. So I have an opinion for that Google Scholar is your friend. Everybody should spend more time with Google Scholar. I claim everybody should spend more time with Google Scholar. The thing is that even if you don't understand the technical innards of a paper, in time you will get the rhythm, you will get the feel. Okay, it is a Thumri and it is an art form, and you will get familiar with what is a Thumri, and then you will start learning that, oh, this is what is going on. So even in a field where you have no ability to grok the technical intricacies of a paper, it's always good to go to the original papers, get the abstract, get the introduction, start comprehending the methodology, skim the results, read the discussion. So the basic engine of papers, we had a EIE episode on how to write a paper, is IMRD. Introduction, methodology, results, discussion. This is how papers are done, except in some foolish fields where they don't do that. But once you get that rhythm, you will be able to suck something out of the introduction. You'll be able to get something out of the methodology, you'll get something out of the results, and you'll generally parse the discussion. So going more to the papers is a good thing, even if it feels disconcerting at first. Speaking for me personally, I am able to read papers in a very large number of disciplines, and that's been part of my recipe. That my first port of call for running searches is not Google Gemini, it is Google Scholar. Amit Bhai, the great philosopher, give us a recommendation today.
So, my recommendation has nothing to do with the subject of the episode, but everything to do with the subject of this episode because everything is everything. This is a great book called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. And, it's as the title says, it's a story of art, and it's a book I dip into every once in a while. It tells stories about works of art which explain the context, which explain exactly what was going on, which explains why it was a survivor that benefited from survivor bias and all of that. And many of us look at art as something arcane. Like, my relationship with art always is that I don't really understand it. I'll respond to it at a certain visceral kind of level. Something looks good, something looks bad, but I don't really get it. And this great magnificent book gives you the story of art through many centuries and is just a masterpiece. And the story of art, Ajay Shah, is also the story of thinking. It is also the story of the human mind. It is also the story of stories. So, yeah, pick up this book. What's your recommendation?
Well, jumping off that, I recommend Civilization by Kenneth Clark, which was like a foundational book for me when I was young. And I want to recommend a song, Seven Bridges Road. First, you may know the live version done by the Eagles that was published in an album in 1980. And then many years later, I found the original by Steve Young in 1969, and they're both wonderful.
And many years after that, I heard a cover version by the good Ajay Shah. He has sung this song, but we'll have to negotiate whether we can put a little bit of that video here. We'll get a copyright strike, for fuck's sake. YouTube is crazy. Thank you.